Hi there. So I'm Elizabeth from the Wade and Wendy team. I'm also one of the conference organizers. So we're really excited about today's conversation, the ethics of AI in recruiting. So I'd like to introduce Athena Karp, CEO and founder of HiredScore, who will be moderating the talk. So please enjoy, like I've said multiple times, underneath the session tab, underneath chat, you can ask any questions here, and please enjoy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Wade and Wendy team, and welcome Drew, organizer and brains behind this. Thank you for having us. The first conference ever moderated where we had a question before the session started. So thank you to our active applicant chat. And just to that, we did put a note at the top. We want to make this as much of a discussion as possible. By design, we chose not to have it scripted, although Paul gives a number of scripted discussions continually globally on this topic. So excited to hear from you guys, and as you have questions, please put them in the chat and we will try to get to everything. So without further ado, we'll get started. I do see people continuing to come in. My name is Athena Karp. I'm CEO and founder of HiredScore. HiredScore is an artificial intelligence talent acquisition technology company. We do candidate screening, sourcing automation, and hiring efficiency, both for employees and candidates for the Global Fortune 500. And one of the big components of what we do is how do we ensure a technology brought to life in recruiting is fair, ethical, and does not either both discriminate against groups and provides as balanced of a perspective as possible in who and how to hire people. So very timely topic. We're grateful to have Paul with us today. Paul, maybe you want to give an introduction to the group?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I'm Paul Root Wolpe. I direct the Center for Ethics at Emory, where I'm also professor of medicine, pediatrics, psychiatry, and sociology, as well as neuroscience and biological behavior. The Center for Ethics is a unique kind of center. Most ethics centers in the United States are bioethics centers because most of the money for ethics is in medicine and life science, but we're a general ethics center. So we do bioethics, and I, in fact, am a bioethicist by training. But we also do organizational and corporate ethics. We do ethics of civil life and civic life. We have an incredible ethics in the arts program. We do have a wonderful food ethics, and on like that. So we do general ethics issues. And of course, as you can imagine, recently we've been preoccupied with both COVID and then more recently with the unfortunate protests and disruptions of our society recently.
So I think, Paul, to that, just before we go into our topic at hand, you've just come out of the last 6 weeks helping our country, our physicians, our hospitals, defining the ethics of ICU bed and ventilator distribution when there are shortages for COVID patients. So I know not exactly related to recruiting, but definitely related to the topics of ethics. One, thank you for your service in helping us define that. And two, any materials that you might want to share.
For people who are interested, so I also happen to be right now the president of an association of bioethics program directors. So we all got together and have been discussing for weeks how, since before COVID really became a crisis, how hospitals should allocate things like ventilators should we get to a point where hospitals are overburdened and now they have to choose between patients who should get a ventilator. So I and my colleagues wrote the policy at Emory. Other people wrote policies across the country, and then we all got together, compared those policies. An article came out in the Annals of Internal Medicine that looks at how it's being done across the country, and one is about to come out in the American Journal of Bioethics, talking about the strategies behind rationing in a time of crisis. So I'm really easy to find at the Emory Center for Ethics. On my email, if anybody would like a copy of any of that, just email me and I'd be happy to send it to you.
Great. So grateful to get your time here today. I think might be helpful if we just kick off this discussion with a definition of ethics that we're going to use for the purpose of this. And you've laid out and educated me greatly on the various ethics of AI, ethics of HR, and the ethics of AI and HR, all of which are their own codes. Maybe you can just give a brief description for this crowd for context.
Great. So let me start with ethics. And I want to say I have a quirky definition of ethics. I'm not a philosopher. Most of my colleagues in ethics are philosophers or theologians or people in religious studies. And I'm a sociologist. So I bring a social science perspective to this, which is kind of rare. And so first, let me tell you what my definition of ethics is, and then I'll tell you why I think most people get ethics wrong. I think there's kind of a key to understanding ethics in a sophisticated way. It's very simple, but most of us are taught about ethics wrong from childhood. So my definition of ethics is how we determine, define, and assess our values in the world. That's what ethics is. And ethics is the application of our values along those three dimensions. What we're taught from the time we're young is if I gave you a sentence and put two blanks in it, and I said, ethics is determining what is blank and blank, every single person on this call would know that it's right and wrong. That's what we're taught from the beginning. Ethics helps us to decide what's the right and the wrong action to do. And it does sometimes, but the vast majority of times, that's not what ethics is. If you think about the ethical dilemmas you have had in your adult life, it's rarely, should I steal that? We know that's wrong. It's not a sophisticated dilemma. Ethicists don't spend a lot of time on that because it's clear. It is always a very different kind of problem. It is not a right versus a wrong. It is always two rights in conflict where you can't satisfy both values. So I spent most of my life studying medical students, and we give them vignettes. And every vignette boils down to something like, the patient wants you to give them this treatment. You don't think this treatment is in their best interest. It's one example. So what do you have? You have the positive value of patient autonomy. Patients should be allowed to determine what's done to their body. And the positive value of my responsibility to the patient. And the problem is both of them can't be satisfied. So then the question is, how do you balance? How do you come to a conclusion of which of two positive values you're going to honor? And that's what ethics really is. It is competing values that cannot be satisfied. And if you think about business, that's what most business ethics problems are. It is this, should I honor my obligation to this stakeholder or that stakeholder? Should I, honor my desire to maximize, my company's bottom line and its health as a company, or should I give a bribe? It's competing values constantly in conflict where we have to balance them. And that explains why it is that well-meaning people, including professional ethicists, arguing the same issue will come to different conclusions sometimes, because it doesn't turn out that I came to the right conclusion and you came to the wrong conclusion. Rather, we are weighing the relative value of these two competing values differently. And that has and if you think that through really deeply, it has enormous implications about how we do ethics, how we think about ethics, how we analyze ethics, especially in business.
And I think, Paul, one thing you've mentioned, which is really interesting to me, is this notion that the ethical questions you ask when considering, should I use artificial intelligence? There's a set of ethical questions you ask when you say, what HR decisions ethically should we make or should we question, and how? And then there's the AI in HR, which is going to produce questions that are fundamentally different and no overlap in the other two question sets. So maybe if you can talk about, how you think about that, and the greater than a sum of the part, both the inability to anticipate the problems that will arrive, and then frameworks that you put in place as those problems do arise.
So I think a good example there is something like transparency or explainability, as we often say in AI. So in HR, am I still on? Because Athena has frozen on my screen. Parents. Oh, okay. Sorry, you froze for a minute. I didn't know if I had frozen too in amongst our audience. So if you take something like transparency or explainability, so if you look at HR in general, that's not a major, it's a minor problem, right? I mean, when you have human beings looking at resumes and trying to decide who should get a position, yes, things should be transparent. Nobody should have a hidden agenda that other people don't know. Nobody should be pursuing conflicts of interest. Yeah, I'm going to push this person because I actually know their mother, but I'm not going to tell anybody, right? There are some transparency issues there, but they're relatively speaking minor and relatively easy to resolve. Yes, you should be transparent and tell us that you have a conflict of interest in this case. But transparency in AI is much, much more complicated, isn't it? Because first of all, AI is extraordinarily complex, right? I mean, we all start, this is a very interesting thing that people I think sometimes have trouble. I mean, once they realize it, they get it, but they don't think about it. And that is, if you and I are looking over a resume, we start from the assumption that I'm a complete human being that works in a certain way. You're a complete human being that works in a certain way. We've got a general sense of how human beings work. We know what human strengths and weaknesses are. So we almost intuitively and naturally take that into account. But AI is the surrogate human being. It's not a tool like a stapler. It is doing processes that normally human beings would do. And therefore, we have to start from way back. We can't take for granted all of those assumptions that we take for granted in human beings so that we can start our analysis past having to say, well, how do human beings think? And how do their brains work? Right? With AI, we have to start there. So what does transparency mean when you're talking about incredibly complex algorithms, multiple algorithms that have interaction effects? We're talking about manipulation of millions of data bits in new ways, new in the sense that we're not used to thinking that way, most people. So it brings up a different set of problems that we have to solve or bring to the interaction that maybe people in HR aren't generally used to thinking about because they haven't been part of the equation before when human beings were the unit of analysis. I can't hear you, Athena. I think Athena will be coming back shortly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great.
Sorry, go ahead.
And for the attendees, my apologies. A tornado wiped through my neighborhood yesterday, with very challenging environments, but glad to be here with you. So one of the questions from the crowd was, what's the ethical thinking around hiring lesser qualified candidates who might be within a group that generally needs access and hasn't had it in the past? I'll let Dr. Wolpe give us some thoughts on that, but I would say one of the things especially we're thinking about in this panel is the ethics of AI in recruiting. And I would question, that's probably an ethical HR question, with or without an AI that you're dealing with on a continual basis. And AI might exacerbate that decision because with an AI, you have to codify decision parameters. And I think, Dr. Wolpe, this is something you talk a lot with me about, this notion that AI is unique in for example, bioengineering or mutating of a gene, or we can further science as far as we want to go, and only then clamp down an ethical framework to, do we use it, do we not, and how do we use it? AI and technology, you can't just let AI progress without taking actions along the way. So I'll let you maybe tackle that. Both points could be interesting.
Yeah, so you have to build ethics into AI. That's what's so interesting about AI and why ethicists are particularly interested in it. We our AI makes decisions. So decisions are always made on the basis of values. Always. The decision on what to have for lunch, whether you realize it or not, are you a vegetarian? Are you eating meat? Are you buying from the local bodega? Or are you going into the fast food restaurant? Those have ethical assumptions behind them. So every decision we make, major decision or significant decision, has ethical values behind it. So the decisions that AI make have ethics and values embedded in them. So that's a perfect example, the example of how do we balance social disadvantage to opportunity, right? And you're right, it's true whether HR is doing it without AI or whether HR is doing it with AI, but it's different if you're doing it with AI. Because what happens when you just do it in HR is the HR team gets together, we say, we're going to take this into consideration. Exactly how are we going to take it into consideration? Well, we'll get the resumes together, we'll see if anybody, I mean, with AI, you have to be absolutely explicit on what you mean by social disadvantage. Can't be, we'll see, because you have to encode it into your algorithm. So you have to define it really clearly, and you have to decide which categories are in and which categories are out. And you can't say, we'll make the decision when we see the resumes. That's too late for AI. Then you have to decide where your cutoff is. What values are going to counteract social disadvantage? So we have this, we have people who are at social disadvantage, and some metric that we're using to determine who should get this position is lower in their case. So we're going to give them a boost because of their social. What are those metrics, right? I mean, in education, it's SAT score or, GPA or something like that, perhaps. But what is it in hiring for very different kinds of positions, right? And then finally, how are we going to evaluate once we've gotten those resumes into the pile, so to speak? And now we're asking AI not to deliver us 12,000 resumes, but 50. What are the cutoff criteria that's going to cut out? So those are all value judgments. And in AI, they can't be tentative like they can in in a human HR process. And so it takes a lot more thought in a sense. And I think it's a very important kind of thought because it forces people to define and clarify their values.
I think it's a great point. One of the reasons clients often like our solutions is because in that exact example you gave, well, we'll see and maybe use best efforts to be inclusive. Every human's definition of best efforts is going to be different. And so what you get is inconsistency across the org versus in an AI, you have to make decisions that matter, but then you have the assurance that the AI is not going to waver from what you've told it to do when it reaches such a scenario. So
Right.
I think it's a really interesting point of points of ambiguity often need to be identified during implementation, and the vendors you work with should also bring best practices and extensive experience in deploying these things to say, hey, if you are ambiguous in these areas of your business, or if data quality is low here, that's going to create these problems. So now let's proactively define some of the parameters we want to put in place so that we don't leave it to machine learning to decide or, luck and chance, right? There's no luck and chance in there. So,
well, but see, and that's interesting because there is a certain value in serendipity, isn't there? That is, if you look at things that's happened in your life, very often it was serendipitous stuff that brought you an opportunity. And I've, sat on many selection committees in higher education and looked through resumes. And sometimes it's some serendipitous thing that made me say, wait a second, let's look at that resume again. You are cutting that out to some level in AI. So there is a trade-off. There is a balance that you're giving. But what you are doing is, in many ways, it's fairer, because what's serendipitously interesting to me is not necessarily serendipitously interesting to the person sitting next to me, right? So there is a kind of random unfairness there, because if it was a different set of people sitting around the table, you might get a different outcome. So, but it, it's the trade-off you need to make.
Yeah. And some of the things we're talking about here, there are laws or case law examples of what to do and how to do it. And I think it raises actually a really interesting question of, one, where there's regulation, you clearly follow that. And then where there's a lack of regulation, probably in very early fields like AI applied to different problem sets, it kind of relies on the people implementing it and the people designing it, because it is a joint contract, in what do you want to proactively strive for and make sure from a solution standpoint are in place or tested or validated, even if there are not yet laws to guide you to that. And I think that's exactly where, you speak a lot about the ethical decisions come into place. And I think with your thoughts, as many of the people listening to us are innovators and transformation leaders within their companies, helping their stakeholders get comfortable with new ways of doing things, specifically with artificial intelligence. And a lot of companies do not have in-house ethicists. They have legal compliance officers. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit more about who you see often playing that role within orgs. Who should it be? Should it be someone, or should it be part of all of us? Should there be ethics training that we do? I mean, a little clarity on that would be great.
Right. So around that issue, there are companies that have, almost all companies have some chief legal officer, and then many companies have a compliance officer and or an ethics officer. Sometimes it's the ethics and compliance officer. Sometimes the compliance function is in the law office and it's a legal model. I find that problematic for a few reasons at that level. First of all, because the responsibilities of the legal counsel of a corporation are fiduciary. That is, they must protect their organization. They are ethically and legally bound to do it, which means that if there's an ethical problem that conflicts with a legal opinion or obligation, they're conflicted. So a separate, independent, ethical opinion is very different than a legal opinion. Compliance is regulatory. Compliance officers are the ones who explain and uphold the regulatory responsibilities of a company. That also is different than ethics. So some companies have a separate ethics officer, or they have someone in the company who serves that role. That being said, I think ethics training is crucial in most companies. I think that ethics is a trickle-down quality of companies. That is, you have to have ethics at the top. You have to have ethics amongst the executives. But as I've seen, and I can give you examples of this, very often there's a lot of wonderful ethical language coming out of C-suite, and then when it hits middle management, it stops, and middle management is saying to their salespeople, for example, yeah, I know that, we need to be ethical, but if you don't make your quota, you're fired. So where are the ethics there? So there are, ethics has to pervade an organization, and that takes work. Ethics doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen naturally. And I think that necessarily, and I think that is part of the issue that a lot of time companies have trouble with, and then they get into ethics problems, and that's when my phone rings. I try to tell companies prophylactic ethics will save you a lot of trouble, but still, it's often not until they have some crisis that they call. But I want to go back to something else you said also, because someone wrote in the chat, asked a question about age. And that is particularly interesting to me because as we were doing our work on ventilator allocation, one of the big issues became age. That is, so now we're at the point where all the ventilators are occupied and we have patients coming in who need them. Should age be a criterion by which we decide who gets a ventilator? There was a big national conversation about this, and there was great disagreement about it. Some hospital policies say yes, give ventilators to younger people over older people, while other hospital policies say you may not take age into consideration. So you have that you have that interesting split. And you have it in HR too. I mean, to what degree should you take age into consideration? And there are lots of course, competing kinds of values. Older people often demand a higher salary. So I mean, there are complicating factors. But if you just take the pure question of age itself, how should you, for any particular position, think about age? And again, that has to be explicit in the AI program, doesn't it? You have to say no one over 40 or whatever it is to the AI program if that's what you're looking for in your resumes. And can you do that? You can do that informally if it's just human beings, because you just don't choose those resumes. But now AI forces you to make certain things explicit that might have been implicit or might have been sort of under the table or hidden when it was just human beings looking through resumes.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great example, because actually one of the things in our solution to try to further reduce ageism and further the hiring of older workforce is that the algorithm, one, by design does not see age. And number two, it's up to the company. When you say 10 years or more experience, if someone has 40 years of experience and they apply, they're treated the same as the candidate that has 11 years of experience, because by design, we've said, we don't want to make a decision about that. We don't want that to be a parameter unless it's explicitly defined as this is an entry-level job for someone with no experience, or this is a job for someone with 2 to 5 years of experience. So I think there are ways that, again, go back to our beginning, which is in the frameworks. If you have the ability to say, this is a parameter we want to proactively address by not putting a boundary by design into that, so that we can hire older people into the workforce, and it can enable that to be a consistently applied principle, right?
But Athena, when you go to talk to a client for the first time, your introductory, and they're talking about that, you have to discuss that value proposition with them. What you just said was a value statement, right? Of how you think about and treat older applicants, right? And that's a value conversation that you end up having with them. That they may not think of it as an ethics conversation or value, but that's what it is. How are we going to consider this group of people and this trait in our selection process?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think, one of the things just to end with for this group, because I'm aware that we have a few minutes left, is there's a lot of places where value and business needs have an exchange and a cross of ethical questions or decision making. And as you've said, it's not black or white. There's a spectrum, and where you want to sit in that spectrum, which that point might change higher or lower at any point in time, and the flexibility of solutions you purchase need to be able, I believe, to move up and along and across those different curves. So one of the things we talk about, I think, right now with just the societal needs, COVID and otherwise, are this notion that more and more things can be automated fully, but do we want to automate them? And where is kind of the two columns, which is the business value and impact versus the ethical questions we want to ask? So I think two things we talked about, which maybe just in a snapshot, you can give us that ethical framework that you would apply. One is, end-to-end automatic hiring with an algorithm, right? There's a lot of companies hiring surge right now. No human can hire 10,000 people in 24 hours. Can we, or should we, have an algorithm go through 100,000 people, figure out which 10,000 to hire, and get them all hired within an hour of apply? One question. And then I think another question that's interesting that we ask is this notion of, as workforces go remote, for example, and there's a lot of questions of worker productivity, and an AI that is monitoring how and how much and in what ways you're working from home. We in many ways can deploy AIs that do that, we being the industry, but should we, and how do we think about kind of these two different decisions that have clear value from a business lens, right?
Right. So you've asked me incredibly complex, important, and deep questions with no time left. But I will say two things about it. One is, as you pointed out to me, once, we accept an error margin in human beings that we don't accept in AI, right? So if we have we know that a human hiring committee does its hiring with 80% accuracy and efficiency, we may accept that. But when you tell someone my algorithms do this with 95% efficiency, they worry a lot about the 5% inefficiency, right? So we think about AI and we think about machine decision making differently than we think about human beings. And where we are in the world right now is we've finally gotten AI to the point where it can make decisions that can substitute for human decision. So we have a deep kind of societal, cultural decision to make about the degree of human agency that we want to give up to machines. And it is a deep and important decision. It's one that, that it's very important as people talk about it and try to resolve it, that they can tease out what the value and ethical components of that are versus the practical components versus legal versus social. And one of the things that ethicists can bring is the skills to say, let's extract the value propositions here so that we can look at them really explicitly, and then you can make the kinds of decisions you have to make to answer your questions in a very kind of intentional and productive way.
Great. Well, I know we're up on time. We still have all of our loyal attendees with us. So if you have another question, we'll stay on for another minute or two, and happy to take another one. Otherwise, you can find Dr. Wolpe at Emory at his email address, and I am at Athena@HiredScore.com, and appreciate everyone's interest and the intention to apply ethics to what it is you're doing, whether you're a HR leader or a solution vendor or a product builder.
Thanks, Athena. Thanks, everybody.